we've got a very, very interesting, exciting, stimulating and I hope thought-provoking for us involved in this major, what Professor Spoonley calls super diversity. So I'll hand over to the Professor in a few minutes, but I'd just like to say he's been researching and writing about immigration, employment, the social issues, the economic trends over the last 30 years. And it must be exciting, I'm sure, for a researcher such as you to be able to look ahead 20 more years and see where is Auckland going to be in 20 years' time? How's that going to affect how you as deliverers and stakeholders of water safety education and all areas associated with aquatics, how it's going to make that different and how different it will be from what's perhaps delivered elsewhere in the country and what other pockets of diversity could perhaps learn from what we are doing here in Auckland. So the aspirations and the residents of these new immigrants, you will be able to point out to us, Professor Spoonley. So I'll hand over to you. And thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Kia ora tata katoa, e na mana e na rangatiratanga o Ngāti Whātua, tēnā koutou. Malola lei, talofa lava, whakamutu mai tū. Ni hao, thank you. We've been given a bunch load of money to look at how Auckland's changing, $3 million actually, and to look at the way immigration is reshaping the city. And we've been given another lot of money last year to look at what New Zealand will look like in 2036. Now, what we're hanging out for is the census stats, because we are short of good statistical data. So if I'd done this presentation in another few weeks, once we've got the first major dump of stats data, it would be slightly different. But I think what I'm going to say is actually quite conservative. And what I would say in another few weeks is a bit more, things will have changed quite a bit more. I guess there are three things I want to do today. One is to really raise the question of how well organisations, WaterSafe and others, are responding to the compositional changes of the population of Auckland. Just to background it, we expect that in the next 20 to 30 years, basically 2/3 of New Zealand's population growth will be here in the city. And what the census has already shown is that a lot of regions are not only flatlining, they're beginning to decline and age. The second thing is that this is an incredibly diverse city. 40% are being born overseas. Children of those immigrants, if you add the children of those immigrants, 56% have been born overseas. There aren't many cities in the world, in fact there's probably only one, Toronto, that is more immigrant dependent than that. So the question for all of us is how well are our organisations responding to the changed diversity of Auckland? And at the moment, I would suggest not very well at all. And it's complicated because for most of our history as a country and as a city, basically 90 to 98% of our migrants came from Britain and Ireland. So from 1840 through to the 1960s. The first wave of non-European migrants obviously came from the Pacific. My argument would be, I came to Auckland in the mid-1970s to research those migrants. My argument would be that we're still struggling with that first non-European migrant arrivals. There are still issues there. We've then had a sort of period in the 80s and 90s when we changed our policies. But I think what I'm going to describe is very much a post-2000 effect. And it's going to change things considerably. And in that effect, what I want to do is just quickly talk about schools and then come to some of the things that I think are important. So, just to ask a question, what does it mean to be an Aucklander in the 21st century? I think we are moving into the second decade. This is a transition decade. I think the 2020s are going to be quite different again, and I'll explain what I mean there in a moment. We've gone through this journey from homogeneity. I'm the son of British migrants. Born in the 50s, went to school in the 60s, university in the 70s. I'm old New Zealand. I don't reflect new Zealand. If we go back to this picture here, older and browner, Yes, I'm the older bit, but I'm not the browner bit. So there is quite a disjuncture between old New Zealand and young New Zealand. Old New Zealand is largely white because Māori deaths, Māori illness has had a significant impact on the ageing of Māori in New Zealand. Younger New Zealand is quite different. So we've got these reconnections, we've called it with the Pacific. We wrote a book last year, and we called it Reconnecting with the Pacific. We've always been part of the Pacific, but we've not had a strong connection with the Pacific other than, outside of New Zealand. I consider us part of New Zealand. And then we've got these new migrations, which really kick in the late 1990s and after 2000. Kaihua Supermarket is the third largest supermarket chain in New Zealand, by the way. So, in terms of Auckland, 1991 I would consider pre these migration changes. And then 2006, which unfortunately is our last major census, isn't it, Moses? Unfortunately, just learning Moses just to work at census. So what we've got there in terms of the Auckland population, and this is going to track on, what we've got there in terms of Māori will make up 11-12% of the population. Population grows, Māori population will grow as well in terms of numbers, but they will stay about the same percentage, around that 11-12%. Pacifica will grow because there's ongoing migration, but also because their fertility is much higher than the rest of the population. So if you look at the kids arriving at school in 2013 as 5-year-olds, you will notice there are very large numbers of Pacifica because they have children at a younger age and they have larger population. By the way, I don't want to get too technical, but population replacement's 2.1 children per fertile woman. Pākehā in this country are down about 1.7. So over on the shore here, which is where I live, the births on the shore are already below replacement level. The thing that's keeping the shore alive is migration. So but that varies around. If you go to South Auckland, births are much more important than migration. Much more important because of that Pacifica effect. What's interesting though, and this is where I really want to labour the point, is that this city will be, above all else, an Asian city in the 21st century. That is the big change. So in 1991, 5%, we've got a few Koreans, some Taiwanese, some Hong Kong Chinese arriving in the country in 1991. We changed the regs in 1987, by the way. So just a few years. So 5%, 19% of the population in 2006 of Auckland are Asians. But post-2000, we're really talking Chinese and Indians. So this year, 2013, half of all the migrants that arrive in the city will be British. The British is still our largest group, by the way, 16%. Will either be British, Indian or Chinese. Half of all migrants arriving here. The other group you should keep an eye on are the Filipinos. They are coming up, and I expect sometime this decade for the numbers of Filipinos arriving in New Zealand to equal the number of Indian and Chinese arriving. So, immigrants, 23%, 37%, now 40% of the population in Auckland. Let's stick with the growth numbers. So we did using the 2006. What would it look like in 2016? It's only a few years away. What you've got here are the actual numbers and the growth. So you can see the effect of the Māori and Pākehā. Not going to grow very much at all. Pacific peoples. I've rounded these out, but look at the Asian community really beginning to kick in. And so already you can see there that the Asian population is already, in 2013, larger than the Māori and Pacifica populations combined. So that's the effect, that's the effect. So in that 10 years, we get 20,000 additional Asians each year arriving and settling here in Auckland. That is net growth. So some will leave, some will stay. That's net growth. That's the number of people who actually stay This is really interesting. This is a restaurant in Meadowlands. No English on that restaurant site. And then if we look into the future, so if we go back to 2006, then around 450,000 Asians, 2021. I think that's where it gets too conservative. So what I'm saying is that we will, within the next 10 years, have around 28%, possibly 30% of the Auckland population who are Asian. We've never had that before. And a lot of us work in institutions which work on models which have no experience of this. And by the way, I don't think many of our institutions use this community and the expertise it has. One or two exceptions, Jenny, North Harbour Sport. Harbour Sport. I don't think we've quite cottoned on to what this means for us as a city, and I don't think we've quite cottoned on as organisations in terms of what that means in terms of a client base, a community base, or using that population in terms of its expertise. So there's quite often a disconnect, and I'll come to that in a moment. So that's really a story of Auckland in these 2 decades. And if you look at the visa categories for New Zealand, then Indian and Chinese dominate a lot of the visa categories. So one of the most interesting is that family reunification, which allows you to bring your parents here, completely dominated by the Chinese. By far the largest group, almost half of people who are bringing family members to New Zealand are Chinese bringing older. And of course you can understand that, one-child policy, kids living in New Zealand, 4 parents in China, if they get married, let's say, 4 parents in China. So what do they do about that? And so that's changing the demography of New Zealand the demography of Auckland quite considerably. So that's a story of the last 10 years, 13 years. It's certainly going to be the story of the next 10 or 15 years of increasingly seeing Asians in Auckland. Now the interesting thing here is that with the Pacifica population, the majority of them are Auckland born. In terms of this population, it's going to be a long time before the majority of them are going to be New Zealand born. They are migrants, they are not New Zealand born. But that aside, I think the New Zealand born and New Zealand raised kids are actually going to change things quite considerably. Just to reinforce something which I think is an important message for those of you who are concerned with water safety. Migrants don't come to New Zealand for economic reasons. Never have, unlikely to. If you want to earn money, you don't come to New Zealand. We don't pay very much. This is not a high-wage economy. You would go to Australia or Canada, you wouldn't come to New Zealand. So what you see around you here is the major reason by far. So if we had to give a percentage, over half of the migrants coming here would identify the lifestyle that is offered here in Auckland as the reason. These education, public education by the way, and public safety would get 10 or 15% support, and then other reasons come much below that. So the reason for coming to New Zealand, the reason for coming and living in Auckland, for migrants, and remember we pick skilled migrants. The migrants who come to New Zealand are very skilled, well-educated people. 60% of the people come to New Zealand under the skilled migration category, skilled and business migration categories. Australia and Canada do the same, most countries don't. So about 65% of those arriving in the US at the moment would come under family reunification. About 30% arrive in New Zealand under family reunification. Our emphasis is very much on skilled people. So these are very skilled, well-educated people who come to New Zealand. This is a map. Now this is a 2006 map, and it's Chinese. The Chinese are the largest Asian community here in Auckland by far. Indians are growing and will compete with them in the future. I'm not sure whether you can see this, but the dark red areas are the suburbs where Chinese make up more than 20% of the population in Auckland. And if you can read this down here, we've got suburbs where there are 35% of the local population are Chinese. Very much confined to a rural fringe down here in Hawak and Pakuranga, the CBD and down Dominion Road, and then on the shore around Northcote and then up in the Albany Basin. This is 2006. In a few weeks we'll have a new map. It will have a lot more red on it because the size of the Chinese population between 2006 and 2030 has grown very, very considerably. It is dominating growth here in Auckland. So probably around 120,000, 130,000 people, Chinese people. So when I talk Asian, this is the largest community, but the other community that you should keep an eye on is the Indian community. So we'd have a map which would look like this. Different areas, of course, and the Indian community. So we're looking forward to grabbing those stats. Education, my second point. If you want an indication of New Zealand in the future, go to schools here in Auckland. You will see the future demography of Auckland in schools. You won't see it in a meeting like this, and you won't see it in lots of parts of Auckland, so go to schools. This is me. It's moi. Leaving class. One Māori, chance too good. Rest Pākehā. This is my son, Nathan, at Rangitoto College. 3 New Zealand born Pākehā in that class. The rest, most of the rest are immigrants. Chinese, Korean, South African, Russian. That's what we are looking at in terms of a future New Zealand. Go to different schools and the mix is different. So I did a talk the other day in a South Auckland school, completely different mix. Completely different mix. About 70% Pacifica, about 10-15% Māori in that school. So it depends on Auckland, but that's what I'm talking about. And when you look at the stats for school enrolments in 2010, we can't pull them out for Auckland at the moment, which is a bit bizarre. But in terms of the northern region, what we've got is that you can begin to see, unfortunately this includes Northland, but you can see the Māori, Pacifica, Māori, Pacifica, and then Asian. So I think that under-reports the Asian, because what we're seeing in Auckland... Hello Annette, how are you? Just sit down quietly there. What we're seeing on the shore is that I teach at the Albany campus of Massey University. 43% of our students now, in 2013, are Asian. If you go to Rangitoto and some of the schools, you will see 30 and 40% of the kids there are Asian. So I think that undersells it a little bit. But what you can already begin to see is that the Pākehā population is going to be outnumbered. And that's what we've got to anticipate and what's already happening. We did some... Okay. I've left my watch behind. We did some work on sports here in Auckland a couple of years ago, 3 years ago actually, for the regional sports organisations. So very, very interesting story. And it's one of those, we do work, as Sandy said, on the labour market, and we've got some issues there, and I'm part of a group called, I'm helping a group called Dragons, Dragon with a Z on the end, and last year they had a session here in Auckland called White or Wrong, and it's about the Asian kids hitting what they see as a bamboo ceiling. I don't think they're going to hang around, by the way. I think these Asian kids are, I went to a prize giving this last week on academic matters. Wow, we are seeing some very talented people coming through, all of them Asian. Every single person who got an academic award at that prize giving bar one was Asian. And we're talking, what, 15, 16 prizes? Everyone. So it's quite an interesting shift that we're beginning to see. So we decided, we were commissioned to look at what's happening in terms of sport. Now, sport is a very interesting bellwether. I mean, schools, yes, sport as well. So, in terms of our orthodox and traditional sports, the arrival of Pacifica supplemented the talent pool here. And of course, in terms of Pacifica, that supplemented the Australian talent pool, and I noticed the British talent pool as well. So, our traditional sports have not quite understood what's happening behind the arrival of Pacifica into the community. Because when you look at these sports, Asians are not playing them, with some exceptions, Jenny A. But, I mean, if you look at registered rugby players in Auckland, the Asian numbers, no, they're not there. Whereas if we look over here, and Lydia Coe, you know, I was part of the AIMS on the shore, and last year Lydia Coe won AIMS's for the top achieving young kids on the shore, and Lydia Coe won the overall prize. And what she represents for me is the way in which sport is changing. Korean, and these sports have benefited hugely. So when we went and talked to the RSOs, the Regional Sports Organisation, these guys have got 78% Asian players. Their coaches, 78% Asian. They run separate Asian or Chinese sports competitions. So if you want to have, again, a look at the future New Zealand, have a look at what's happening in some of these sports. It's very, very interesting. You know, I think we're in the crossover decade. I think by the end of this decade, you will see these sports struggling in terms of their talent pool. They'll still have very good players, but if you think about it, so on the shore, I think about 1% of rugby players registered. Hello, Mary. Come and sit up the front.
I'm just thinking I should be there. Thank you all very much. I'll leave it with you.
Okay. You've immediately got an issue, because if 1% of the rugby players on the shore, registered rugby players on the shore, are Asian, and yet 40% of our schools, 43% of our universities are Asian, you've got a significant contraction of your talent pool and the numbers of people playing the sport. They might be interested in the sport, but playing the sport, no. And I'm not sure that our sporting organisations on this side of the ledger have actually understood what the next decade's going to bring. They're going to have to do business very, very differently. Otherwise, yeah.
The young person's survey, 2012, Sport New Zealand, swimming was the most popular pastime.
Yes.
Where does swimming fit into what you see as?
I was actually thinking of sports that organise competitions and have registered players, and there's some sports like walking, swimming, reading, do we include reading? Which people do, but are not part of an organised club competition. So,
Sorry, can I,
recreation.
just from a structured swimming point of view, we are seeing a lot more Asian people swimming coming through the school system and into clubs.
Yeah, and the trends will change, and so like last year with the Rugby World Cup, Asian communities in Auckland took a lot more interest in rugby, of course. But when we looked at the participation of Asians, we looked at all ethnic communities and their participation in sports, but let's stick with the Asian. When we looked at Asian participation in those sports, there's a huge disconnect and a divergence between some sports and others. And what's interesting is what those traditional sports are going to do. And North Harbour have tried to do stuff, messages in Mandarin and Cantonese. You know, there is stuff happening. But it's just a very interesting story in terms of Auckland. And just look at, and you know, you'd want to add in other sports here. Suddenly baseball's taken off. Who's playing baseball? Asians. But look at where Jenny and I live on the shore. You know, if you look around golf and you look at the players, but you look at who owns the golf courses and who owns the golf shops, no doubt about it, Koreans big time. And so when we look at the Koreans, we look at Korean migration to New Zealand. When we look at Koreans, they're quite often very affluent, they quite often move into a semi-retirement mode, but they participate in some leisure activities. And so they're going to transform, and are transforming, golf. And Lydia's the example of that. So, Tana, Umama? Lydia Coe, nice contrast. So I'm just going to wrap up now, because what we struggle with as a university, but what we struggle with as a research team, so when we spend this money, we're trying to get a sense of what immigrant communities experience when they come to Auckland and what their impact is going to be, what their impact is. We've decided that there are some key things that need to be addressed. Quite often, what we've done is tend to assume that incoming people will do what we do. And I think what we need to do is begin to accept that cultural practices are quite different for these communities, and that we've got to adjust to them. The expectation that they should adjust to us, I think in a diverse city like Auckland, is misplaced. What you're going to do, and the media are a case in point here, what you're going to do is struggle to connect with those communities. So if we took the media as an example, you will find that Asian engagement with our mainstream media, print, television or radio, is actually very low. What they've done is establish their own media, and they've also got homeland media. So those big discs outside houses is so that you can watch Chinese or Korean TV. But what's interesting, and what you might not know, is that there are 28 Asian newspapers printed in Auckland. So if you go to the Asian alley in Albert Street, you quite often see some of those there. If you go to WTV in Ellerslie, they broadcast in Korean, Mandarin, Cantonese and English. They've got a whole series of television stations and radio stations, and I understand they're beginning to print as well. So what I think we've got to do is begin to change our mindset and begin to reach out to these communities and understand that they do things differently. So what is going to be our message to those communities? Because our long-standing message, how we do things in an orthodox sense, might not work. So that's the first thing. The second thing is cultural practices. And I was part of a team that when Pacifica came to Auckland, we used to write little books called Understanding Pākehā. And looking back, they were a bit naive and a bit patronising. But what we did was we provided organisations in Auckland with some guidelines. If a Pacifica person doesn't look you in the eye, it doesn't mean, as we would assume, that they're shifty. It is a cultural practice. If they decide to sit down when they come into a room rather than wait to be invited to sit down, it doesn't mean that they're being presumptuous. That is a cultural practice. And so we've got an interesting shift in terms of how we engage those communities. Language is important. We've tended to assume that people should speak English. And I don't think that's how we will operate in the future. You can continue to expect that, and we should. I mean, English is the language that... I'm going to have to stop for a minute here. English is the language that is dominant here, but look at the languages that will be spoken in this year's census. So Samoan has tended to be quite often the second most commonly spoken language in Auckland. No more. It'll be Mandarin by a long way. A long way. So these are people who are native speakers of Mandarin and whose children will quite often speak Mandarin and possibly Cantonese. So what we've done is we tried to engage these communities. When I rocked up, I spoke in English. We got no purchase whatsoever in terms of talking to those communities. What we've done is recruit people from those communities as our champions. They are native speakers, they are known in those communities, they are trusted in those communities, so we've had these brokers. And think the question for all of us is what those champions look like, who they are. And I mean, I was talking with Jenny before about the Chinese New Settlers Trust here in Auckland, who are just going from strength to strength, and they've just got a whole lot of new money to build housing. And you know, when you see somebody like Jenny Wang, who's the chief executive, new Chinese entrepreneur, doing some fascinating things with the Chinese community in Ellerslie, based in Panmure, thank you. I knew I got that wrong. Thank you, Mary. Based in Panmure. I just think that there's a new set of organisations and a new set of people that are beginning to operate in these communities, and we're not quite often. I don't think we understand that. So, for all of us in this room, I think there are shifts that we've got to do as organisations in terms of who we recruit, how we speak to those communities, what the messages are, and beginning to accept that we are possibly going to have to change things in terms of our own practices. Can I say that one final thing, and that is that I've already made a point about prize giving and this new Asian generation. I think they're going to be quite outstanding in many respects. They haven't had much of an impact on how we do things in Auckland yet, but that's because they're quite young. Remember that the first generation of New Zealand-born Asians are really only beginning to appear at university now. So what we want to do is, if you look at our primary and secondary schools, you can see the numbers coming through and what their performance is like. In terms of the future, I've said Chinese and I should have put Asians up there. In terms of the future, what I'm impressed by is their approach to life and their approach to things like academic success, being in a university. These are our top performers. And these are people who are really going to change our landscape in many ways. I do have some questions. I think in terms of Pacifica communities, you've seen that breakthrough generation, and you've seen those people. All our top sports teams have been captained by Pacifica. So we've got some questions to ask, and this is in the future. I don't think we're going to see it through this decade, but I just think when I said from Asian geek to glamour, I was being a bit tongue-in-cheek, but what we're seeing is these kids beginning to have an impact on our educational landscape. But what happens when they start and move out into more public venues and begin to have an impact on how we look and how we sound, our dress and our media? You know, when's the Chinese equivalent of Brotown or Number 2 or Siona's Wedding going to come along? Well, there have been some, but I think it's yet to come. I think the language and culture of the second generation is going to be quite important. And we've seen language maintenance of heritage languages, as they're called, becoming quite an issue. But in these communities, because they are first generation, because the parents speak in the home in particular, and sometimes in the business, Mandarin or Korean, the uptake of language in that second generation is very, very high. So these are bilingual, quite often trilingual speakers. Not many of us in this room can say that, but these got a different set of skills. Will they stay? Well, in the late 1980s, we looked at secondary school kids on the shore, year 12 and 13. They weren't going to stay, the Asian kids. It was boring. They thought it was much more exciting to go overseas, but they have stayed. If you look at the people that move on to Australia, and we've had 5 years of incredible movement out to Australia, there aren't many immigrants. Despite urban mythology, not many of the immigrants moved on to Australia. Most of the people who've gone to live in Australia have been New Zealand-born, Pacifica, Maori and Pākehā. They're not Asians, despite what people might think. And they've stayed because they're doing well, because they've got educational credentials, because they're starting to establish families, and because they're starting to establish jobs. So our retention here of Asian migrants is actually very, very high. And so the question I've got is where that leadership's going to come from and what it's going to do. So I'm seeing, if I go back to Dragons, I'm seeing these kids who tend to be in their late teens, early 20s, really beginning to challenge the organisations and say, you know, have you got a bamboo ceiling? Are you not employing us because we're Asian? We speak perfectly good English. We've got very good credentials, but you see us firstly and foremostly as an Asian. Shouldn't you be rethinking here? So these kids are, I think, got some really interesting challenges for us. Final thing, keep an eye on those Asians. Immigration is going to become more important, not less important. If you suddenly think this is going to all dry up, no, it's not. As a country, we're ageing, and already as we come out of the global financial crisis, employers here in Auckland are reporting skill shortages. And you might have heard this morning's radio, and what they're doing is recruiting significantly overseas for the Christchurch rebuild. So it's very much about skills recruitment. 60% of the people, as I said before, we're recruiting as immigrants because they've got skills, but we're going to have to store up our population. I've just come back from Germany. Germany has the second oldest population in the world. Japan has the oldest. The Germans, in the next 10 years, very successful economy, but because they're aging so rapidly, and because the school-age populations are crunching, they're going to have to recruit big time. And of course, what they've tended to recruit, unlike us, is they've tended to recruit unskilled immigrants. And they're going to have to compete internationally to get those skills recruited, because they're going to struggle. So, you've heard me. This is really about these two big waves of migration of Pacifica and Asia. So how are we reaching out to those? And the final question I've got is, how welcoming are we? And how understanding are we? And what are we doing to adjust to this new... I had another slide there. I obviously don't. So what are we doing to adjust to this new Auckland? And by the end of this decade, if it's already different, it's going to be much more different. And by 2030, even more different again. This is not a tap that we turn off. This is not a change that we can suddenly stop or reverse. This is going to carry on. The two talent pools that we have in our part of the world, where there is excess skilled talent that we can recruit out of India and China, that's not going to change. So the third group will be for the Philippines. It'll be elder care, health care, it'll be construction, and it'll be dairy, interestingly enough. So that's a future New Zealand and a future Auckland. And so my challenge is the one I started with. How we as organisations respond to that challenge. Thank you very much, Nate.
I've got a quick question on that. You did some research in terms of sporting organisations.
Yes.
Have you got anything to add around future population and their desire to actually do organised sport versus leisure activities?
Yeah. We asked Asian communities about that, and there was some really interesting responses. Sorry, this is a couple of minutes. One is that we asked about their engagement in organised sport, and they said, well, organised sport's not very responsive to us. And it came up in various ways. So it's the Muslim woman wanting a gym space or a swimming space or a sports space which doesn't have males in it. And New Zealand Sport said, no, we don't do that. You've got to, this is where I think you've got to do it like us, or you don't do it at all. So the Muslim community feel very, very strong about that. And Australia has adopted a swimming suit which reflects Muslim sensibilities. We haven't. And I don't know, is anybody from netball in New Zealand here? See, netball, I think. Short skirts. Do you remember that there was a case in Christchurch of a Pākehā girl who wanted to wear tracksuits underneath, and netball in New Zealand said, no, not doing that. So you can imagine when we come to cultural communities, it's difficult. But we had other things which was interesting. So, Ramadan, playing cricket, no food. And by the way, the food at after match functions, not appropriate food. Pork, no. So we were. What was interesting was the some of the sports organisations understood that, but when you talk to the communities, they had very strong views about a whole series of practices of organised sport. One of the most difficult is that sport tends to take place on Saturdays. Saturday is a day of work for these Asian communities. They work at school during the kids at school during the week. They're expected to help their parents in a business on a Saturday and a Sunday. How do you cope with that? Well, what badminton have done, what badminton have done have got a card swipe system. So if you go to a badminton court in many parts of Auckland, you'll see Asian kids playing at sort of midnight or 2 a.m. in the morning. They just do a card swipe system and then they play. Jenny and I were talking before, football has a problem because the Asians have decided that they will play on Sundays on sports pitches, as in soccer, sports pitches around Auckland, and the football guys are saying, "Boy, you can't do that, you've got to be organised, you've got to pay us some money," and all of that sort of stuff. And the Asians say, "What? This is how we do it." Look at so there's a whole lot of tension points with organised sport at the moment, and I'm not sure. I mean, we feed back, but I'm not sure organised sport quite understands how big some of those barriers are, and how intractable sports organisations appear to be to some of those requests.
Might also just
Yes,
add
Jen.
that because we've organised a couple of Chinese sport forums in the previous years, and a lot of things that came out of that was that because from Asian countries, their sports structure is really different, and it's a lot of casual
You need to
sport.
Jenny Lim, identify who you are.
I'm Jenny Lim from Harbour Sport. I lead the Activation Project, which is promoting sport in the Asian community. And yeah, so we're seeing a lot of people who are coming from countries whose sports structure is very much casual, very much community run and pay to play, and they come here where our traditional sports structure is very much a railway system where it's really, you've got one pathway and that's a pathway. And we look at football where they've got a really clear pathway to playing, to participation, and then you get sub-football, which is, I think some of you may have played that. It's casual, you put your little corporate team together, you show up. If you can't play, you get someone to cover for you, and it's very much, and it's modified, and it's fun, and it's kind of not a lot of rules, and that's where you see the high Asian participation is. They want to be able to determine how they play sport, and I don't think that's necessarily a cultural thing. You see young people who are getting into, social netball as opposed to traditional netball in school, sub-football as opposed to their football clubs. So I think there's also a shift in, I guess you would call it pluralization. It's getting that choice to be able to do something else as opposed to showing up every Wednesday. So yeah, there's a shift there as well.
Can I add something which I think is relevant to WaterSafe in particular, and that is that I think Jenny's absolutely right, but when it comes to, for example, our beaches, and they do the casual thing, then there are major dangers. And the question is, how do you get, because it's often casual, it's difficult to know how to talk to the communities, how do you get your message across to them? I saw it. How do you get your message across to them before they put themselves in danger out at Piha fishing off the rocks? I mean, it's a real challenge because it's so casualised and it's quite different from some of the things we've done. You need to introduce yourself as well.
No, I'm just going to ask you.
No, you should introduce yourself.
Can I chair of Auckland Council's Ethnic People's Advisory Panel? Paul, just on three things that you talked about, the sports and the time sports are going into. I would question that. I would think a lot of what's called the Asian, if you go to the gyms, they are bulking themselves up, and I think they're not bulking themselves up for golf or badminton. I think it is with the intention of playing sports like rugby, because they are the generation that knows they want to fit in, and they've quite adapted themselves to rugby. The second point you made about the students and their academic achievement in getting the prizes, well, the Ethnic People's Advisory Panel just ran a very successful ethnic youth hui, a large contingent of which did come from Massey University, but a lot of them, one of the main concerns in the discussion was that they did not want to follow the path that the parents had prescribed to them. A lot of them had grown up here, and they were looking to get into the social sciences areas, to get into areas that were not traditionally what was expected of them. And you will find, as you would you would know, having taught the students yourselves, that there's a distinct difference between the core paper of how the students approach studies as to those that have come here. They're very much like, I would say, Kiwi in their approach, very more lax in activity, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but they also have a wider engagement with their colleagues. And the third point you alluded to about we must adapt to them. We've always asked these communities to adapt to us. I do not know who the us you are referring to, but I think when you pointed out, yes, I know, and that is where I would question that, because if you look at, I do not know about the student super diversity, and I really dislike the term you're a majority of minorities. I do not ever see myself a minority, even though there are only about 50 of us from Trinidad, but we are populations. But I would say it's not adapting to you, but it's us adapting to each other, because we are the ones that will make up those populations.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that message. I was just challenging that. In terms of the first point, Camille, that might well be true, but we're not seeing it in terms of registrations in those sports yet. So it might occur over time. I definitely think that this generation is going to be quite different. So we should think about immigrant parents and their kids quite separately. I think their behaviours are different. And Jenny and I were talking about somebody we know in common from one of those communities who I suspect frustrates the hell out of his mother, because he's done okay academically, but he's pretty laid back. So, he's adopted some of the attitudes of New Zealanders broadly. Yeah. So, but that's my point about this being a transition decade in terms of what's going to happen.
I'm going to have to stop you there, Paul.
Yes,
Thank you very much. And I'm hoping we'll have some opportunity at the end of our second speaker to be able to continue that dialogue. But just to sum up, thank you very much, Paul. I think the focus on compositional changes for our organisations has really made us think about the shifts perhaps that we do need to think about. Not only our recruitment strategies, but our messages, and more importantly, the response that we do to the people that we are serving.